himself, and as a result, or maybe not as a result, he wrote a book arguing in favor of same-sex marriage. And so his book became real popular, and so we need to look at his arguments this morning. And what I'd like to do is I read through the book very carefully, making, highlighting and everything else. Then I went through the book a second time very carefully with the objective of being able to summarize his arguments accurately such that no one would question or suggest that I had misrepresented his arguments. I wanted them to be totally accurate. There's no point in addressing an argument that's not actually presented by the person. And so what I'd like to do is I'll present, for each of the argument, I'd like to present a summary of it, a syllogism. Syllogism is something that's handy to know about. Syllogism is basically just a very short summary of an argument in form of premises and a conclusion. But what I'd like to do is as I show the argument on the page, I would like, for each argument, just to pause and see, rather than me comment on the argument, which I may still do, but I'd like to see if any of you here have a red flag or there's any concerns about that argument, okay? So let's start with the God made me this way argument, which is one of the several that he presents in his book. So the argument, basically, I have more thorough, more lengthy treatment of his book, where I have all the citations of the page numbers and so forth and the quotes. This is a little more streamlined version, but this is a quote. Creation is good, the body's good, sexuality as a core part of the body is also good. And so this is just a statement that kind of encapsulates his first argument, the God made me this way argument. So if you were to summarize that argument, you could say proposition number one is God made the body good. And that follows from creation is good, the body's good. So God made the body good. Our sexuality is part of the body, therefore it logically follows that our sexuality is from God and it is good. And of course, when he's talking about sexuality, he's not just talking about men and women, he's talking about same-sex sexuality. So let me pause there. Does anybody have any concern with this argument? Or is it a red flag? Any vaguely unsettled thoughts? Okay, the purpose of the body is not necessarily just for sex alone, and that's very true. That'd probably be a secondary one, Nick.
I think actually the three things that he's saying is right, but in the essence that he says sexuality, right? So our sexuality is from God and it is good. That's a true statement, but it's not the sexuality that is from God is good. Mm-hmm. And homosexuality is not from God. It is not good. Okay. Read Genesis, it's pretty obvious that it was designed to be male and female. So okay. That is what is from God and that is what is good.
So you might suggest there's at least one or two missing premises here that have been missed out. God made the body good, but the question is it still good? Or what about the fall? A question, in philosophy, we always, first thing you do, you lay out the argument accurately, and then we all discuss it and say, now, what do we think about this argument? And a question that would come to mind is, well, what about the fall of humanity? Has that affected our body, or more specifically, has that affected our sexuality? And what Vines has done here is he has totally not talked about how the fall may have affected our sexuality. Now, of course, we need some grounds for raising that question, some suspicion, and here's just one of many that would cast suspicion on the on the assumption that our sexuality, the human sexuality, has never been corrupted. It's still good the way God made it. So here's one verse that might raise some concerns. In reference to your former manner of life, that is, before you became spiritually reborn, it says, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit. Now, this is a more general statement. The old self covers more than just sexuality, but there's a natural way we are. And if you want to see the natural way we are, just have a bunch of kids. I have 6. We never had to teach them how to lie. We never had to teach them how to hit each other. We absolutely did not have to teach them how to take each other's toys. That all came naturally. Selfishness is a natural part of the old nature. And that's just one example. We're not focusing on sexuality here. We're just focusing on the more general problems. So we see there's a general problem that, yes, God made the body good, but there's now something about us which he refers to the old self. Other translations and other passages might refer to it as the natural person is being corrupted, and that's a present tense. It's getting worse. It's like where I live, there's lots of groundhogs, and they'll cross the highway and they'll get hit every once in a while. And if it's summertime, if you happen to have that's on your route for the day, it just gets worse every day. It's hot, and that groundhog starts swelling up like a balloon, and I need not go into further, but this concept of this ongoing thing that's happening to the groundhog is that same concept he's using about our old nature. It's not getting better. We cannot conclude that our sexuality is good and that God made us this way. There's a very clear indication, which is not actually from this verse. This is a general statement about the old nature, but we'll look at some stuff in a minute. There's a very clear indication in the Bible that our natural sexuality has become corrupted. And also we cannot change our old nature. Now, the natural sexuality, you begin to get clues on that when you start seeing all the verses that say, abstain from sexual immorality. Well, if God made the body and it's good and sexuality is good, then what's he talking about sexual immorality? Our sexuality is good. No, there's still aspects, yeah.
Are we still talking natural sexuality is like, are we looking at it in God's perspective of man and woman? Is there anything more we're looking at?
We're looking at the whole spectrum of human sexuality, just whatever people do with their sexuality. The whole spectrum, including male and female and everything else.
I don't think the fact that God created us as male and female is corrupted.
Well, that isn't corrupted, no, but how we use that sexuality, we just have to look, like say online porn, for example. There's plenty of straight people who like to soak up a lot of online porn, and let's call it straight porn. So there's something still gone wrong with even our sexuality, even if it's straight. Something has gone wrong, and I'll illustrate that shortly. It's not that it's wrong for men to be attracted to women or vice versa. That's not wrong. But something has gone off kilter here, and we'll expand on that just in a minute. In fact, C.S. Lewis expands on that right here. So maybe tell me if this adds a bit of clarity. So, okay, back in the C.S. Lewis days, they had things called burlesque shows. Not 100% clear what goes on in a burlesque show, but the main idea was that a woman slowly undressed on stage to music. But you didn't see a whole lot, and then you got glimpses and flashes, and then at the very end, maybe you got a better glimpse, and then the lights went out or whatever, the fan covered her up or whatever, and it was over. So with that in mind, C.S. Lewis writes, you can get a large audience together to watch a girl slowly reveal, I can't remember what was in there, that's my verse, slowly reveal more of her body. Now suppose you come to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so that it let everyone see just before the lights went out that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? And would you not anyone who had grown up in a different world think that there was something equally queer about the state of the sex instinct among us? There's nothing to be ashamed of enjoying your food. There'd be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. C.S. Lewis had such a way of putting things. But, I mean, he long before the internet and what's going on in the world right now. Like, a friend of mine is a professional psychologist, Christian psychologist, specializing in porn addiction. And he sent out an email newsletter a couple of years ago, and he started saying, you know, what are the percentages of the different, who are the top 10 nations looking at this stuff, and how much money is spent per year? And it's exactly what he's describing here. Just think of food. You'd say, wow, like when you look at these people, they seem to be, at first you'd think they were starving to death. But then you look at them and no, they're not starving to death. That's not why they're staring at this mutton chop. And you say, there's something obviously wrong with their appetite. In the same way, there's something gone horribly wrong with the human sexual appetite, at least for a good chunk of the population. Literally billions are being spent per year in watching on and subscribing to or whatever you pay money for online for porn. Literally billions. And so this is odd. Like, this is very odd, C.S. Lewis would say. And the whole point is that we cannot say that human sexuality is good when in fact God then follows that up. It was initially good as created before the fall, pure, right, holy. And even there's still pure aspects. Say sex within marriage is pure and holy and right and good. There's nothing wrong with that. That's, in fact, not only is there nothing wrong with that, it's beautiful and good. So, Song of Solomon. I know that some people think Song of Solomon is a picture of Christ's relationship with the church, but I just, like, there's too much erotic language in there. It just seems badly inappropriate if we're talking about our relationship with the Lord. So the other major school of thought is that the purpose of the Song of Solomon, and there's passages in there that I'd be embarrassed to read here. Like, don't ask me to read the scripture reading that particular Sunday if there's particular passages that I got to read out loud. It's just embarrassing, awkward. What I think, and I could be wrong here, but I suspect the main reason for the Song of Solomon is to show an endorsement from God that romance and sex and erotic attraction and all of that is holy, actually, within the context of marriage. It's holy and beautiful and good. There's nothing wrong with that. But just because something is holy, beautiful, and good does not mean that it can be used for wrong things or wrong ways. In fact, in Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis, in another one of his books, there's a conversation between the senior demon and the junior, and one of the senior demon says, "We have never been able to invent a pleasure." He's talking about the fallen angels there. Only the enemy has that ability. The enemy is his word for God. He says, all we can do, he says, is get people to misuse it, use it in the wrong way, in the wrong place, to twist it, to distort it. And that has obviously happened within humanity. And it's not just Satan doing it to us. There's something within our own old nature that has twisted our human sexuality. So we cannot assume that sexuality, broadly speaking, whatever it happens to be, and in his case, it's same-sex relationships, is good, especially in light of what God says about it for the remainder of the Bible. In every case, he uses very negative terms, strongly negative terms. In every case, no exceptions. So it's going to take a whole book to try and make the Bible says the opposite of what it appears to say if you want to argue that God's fine with same-sex marriage. It's going to take a whole book. Let's go to sexual orientation argument. It's just, in summary, I would say a summary statement is the Bible makes it abundantly clear, given all the things it says about abstaining from sexual morality, that something has gone wrong with human sexuality. But it doesn't mean it's totally depraved. There's still the pure in with the bad. It's a mix. It's the old nature. Second argument here, and again, as I walk through this, think through, and then I want to ask you, what concerns might you have here? Same-sex orientation was unknown in ancient times. That's his first premise. If one is true, then references in the Bible do not address same-sex as an orientation. Okay, so let me clarify here. So Vine looks at a number of maybe 5, 6 historical ancient documents that happen to reference same-sex relations. And he distinguishes between same-sex relations or homosexual relationships, or sex, let's just say homosexual sex, and sexual orientation. He makes a distinction there. So he's saying sexual orientation was unknown in ancient times. Yes, men had sex with men. For example, Roman soldiers would sometimes have sex with each other out while they're on a campaign somewhere. There's one ancient citation regarding that, written about 1,400 years after Mount Sinai. There's another citation where when an army conquered another nation, they would take the king or the generals or whatever, and then the victorious male soldiers would rape the conquered male soldiers, just as an act of domination, I suppose. And I don't get that personally. It's the last thing I'm thinking of if I conquered somebody, but that was a thing in some cultures. The soldiers rape the conquered soldiers, especially the king. And there was other things they would do to humble the king. They would strip him naked and put hooks in him and lead him by hooks and ropes, stark naked after raping him or whatever. The objective there was to absolutely humiliate, and Vines would agree that's wrong. You shouldn't be raping, men should not rape men. That's wrong, and he would agree with that. But he's talking about sexual orientation as this is your natural attraction. You're naturally sexually attracted to men who are naturally same-sex attracted is what he's basically saying. So what he's saying is that same-sex attraction and sex within that context was unknown in ancient times.
Is it not mentioned in Romans? In the beginning of Romans?
Yeah, well, it talks about men and women having desire with one another. Was there a hand back there? Oh, okay. It does talk about that, but Vines goes on to say that that's how it's burning with passion. So he distinguishes between burning with passion for somebody of the opposite or someone that you're sexually attracted to, and then a wholesome sexual attraction. So he's distinguishing between those two. Now the problem with that, it says they burned with passion to one another, and then it says, to read it further, they committed detestable acts, or there's different adjectives used depending on your translation. So it's kind of hard. So I'm trying to take Vine's side here for a little bit to help you understand. So a number of citations from a number of ancient sources, but one of the primary problems, no, I'm not going to tell you the problem here. So therefore, it logically follows that new information on same-sex orientation requires us to reinterpret Scripture on either same-sex behavior or celibacy, no matter what stance we take on sex relationships. So if you don't think same-sex relationships are good, you're going to have to reinterpret what the Bible says about celibacy, or vice versa. Now, we'll look at the celibacy argument shortly. Any comments on this argument? That same-sex orientation, that there were no gay people in ancient times, yes?
I'm not saying I believe this, but I have heard something about like just the interpretation of the Bible and saying homosexuality is wrong in the sense of what you were talking about, men raping men. Not necessarily in the sense of same-sex attraction.
Yeah. So it'd be.
That was just an interpretation.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I believe that.
Yeah.
It's just that's.
No, and you're right. That is. We're going to actually come to that one. But the point here is just as it's wrong for a man who's attracted to women to rape a woman, so Vines would argue that it's wrong for a man that's attracted to other men to rape a man. But within the context, and Vines makes this clear, within a committed monogamous marriage, we would say straight sex is good within the context of a man-woman marriage, but he would argue gay sex is good within a marriage between two men or two women. But your point is an important point, because he would argue that actually homosexual sex would be wrong in all contexts except for within marriage. So we'll come to that. But any other comments on this? There's a big problem here, because
You're talking about pulling out what from there, like what we see as red flags.
yeah,
The word reinterpret Scripture.
yeah, there's a red flag. Reinterpret. Yeah,
Yeah.
reinterpret. What does that mean? It's
Because when we are in Romans, it talks
Yeah.
So if you're going to reinterpret that as, well, you can do that in an honorable, good way.
Yeah. It requires a lot of, like we talked about the other day, it requires the principle of parsimony comes in because it requires a lot of talking to try and make the Romans 1 massage it so that it's actually okay, sort of okay, at least in marriage. So that's a good point. Another major problem is and this is, I am shocked that this actually flies in the academic world, for some people at least, is you can never do an archaeological dig, say in Italy, and find a fragment written 1,000 years later from what's given at Mount Sinai, and thousands of miles away from where that command was given. It's not like back then it was like a global internet culture here. 1,000 miles away was a totally different world. And 1,400 years away was a totally different world. And yet he picks these things, none of which are at Mount Sinai or in that context of Hebrew culture, and then extrapolates across centuries and even more than 1,000 years and across thousands of miles, extrapolates back to Mount Sinai and say, well, they didn't know about sexual orientation back then. Another phenomenal thing that just secular people have an issue with this argument, and there's been a lot of talk on this, they say, are you telling me, Matthew, that there were no gay men, like gay as in sexual orientation, until recent times? Like that just strains credulity that there were no same-sex attracted men until recently. And therefore, he's not talking about same-sex attraction here. Nick?
Are we not supposed to make arguments out of silence? I mean, I know that's kind of like where you were going with that, but like, that's kind of where it seems to be building his whole point, I guess.
You mean, what do you mean argument? Where he's not completely making it from silence. Well, one of the things he's saying is he's ignoring what says Mount Sinai, which is right there in the culture at the time, and instead, we would call that appeal to selective evidence. He's selecting evidence that's completely out of context in history and in time. Sorry, in history and in geography. And applying that here, but totally just, okay.
Sorry, what was the author's name of this book?
Matthew Vines. Matthew Vines. Okay, so let me just say a few comments about this. Number one, it's very questionable to construct Hebrew society's view from single snapshots taken from other cultures and times. So let's say, for example, we have an apocalypse now, and 1,000 years from now, somebody's doing an archaeological dig in Paris, and they find a scrap of erotic literature. And that's all they have to go with what sexuality was like in the 21st century. Or maybe let's say they find some literature that's circulated amongst pedophiles. And that's all they have to reconstruct sexuality in the 21st century. Well, you can see right there's going to be a massive issue. You've got such a tiny sampling. It's a sampling problem. And what he's doing here is he's got a sampling problem. The sample size is pretty small to start off with, 5 or 6 ancient quotes. But that's not as big of a problem as where the samples are coming from. So if I want to say, what is your thinking here at Anchor House with regard to, let's say, eating pork? But I'm not going to sample you guys. We're going to go send one person to San Francisco, another person to Alaska, another person to, let's say, Algeria, and then we'll come back and we'll see what people at Anchor House believed about pork. Well, that's just like you haven't, the samples are way outside your area of interest, which is how do we feel about eating pork at Anchor House. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it assumes that either the Bible was written just by men who were limited by their own knowledge at the time, so it was just a man-made document. Of course, they didn't know about 21st century gay sex and gay orientations and that kind of stuff. Or, if it is inspired by God, then it assumes that God didn't know about sexual orientation. Because he's not just writing it for those people at that time. He's writing it for all people for all time. Now, there's going to be an obsolescent thing here we're going to deal with shortly. So that's a major issue. But we'll come back to are those moral commands of Mount Sinai still relevant today? We're going to come back to that one. Because people will say, well, you eat bacon now, so what's the problem? You wear clothes that are made of mixed materials. So if that's the case, how come you're just fixating on this one thing and saying, it says no sex between men. Okay, we can't do that. Basically, there were 4 types of sexual immorality at Sinai. Number 1 was incest. No incest. Number 2 was no adultery. And number 3, no sex between same-sex people. And number 4, no sex with animals. Those are the 4 things at Mount Sinai. Now, it's interesting that our culture today is still a little sketchy when it comes to incest, although there was a big court case in the UK. He's fighting that, it was between a father and a daughter. They both love each other. They've been sleeping together and all this. Why can't they have a legal marriage? And this is just an outworn appendage of ancient religious stuff that you can't marry your daughter or whatever, or marry your dad. I don't know how that case has turned out in the English courts or the UK courts. But generally, we have a problem with incest. We still have a bit of a problem with adultery. Even if it's serial, even if people live together in serial relationships, most guys and girls who are living with each other have an issue if their partner's also sleeping with somebody down the street. They get upset about that. Now, I do know and I'm aware that there's a movement towards promoting polyamory. And I've met in my talks that polyamory, that's sex with anybody. And open relationships, like you go for coffee with lots of people, why not, go for sex with lots of people? And there was a paper published, I think it was last year, saying that's actually the most healthy kind of relationships are polyamorous relationships. So you ought to be watching when you see papers published in humanities journals as science journals. You say, "Oh, what kind of sample size? Oh, that's pretty small." How long was this study done for? For immediate? Yeah, okay, immediate. People having sex with everybody else, having a good time. But what are the long-term consequences? Long-term consequences are devastating for human society. They're devastating for the family. They're devastating for mental health. There's a lot of longer term. They never even looked at that in that study. And so that study could be, I know from my perspective, I am so thankful that we don't practice, that my wife and I don't practice polyamory. It's just so destructive. I can't even imagine having a meaningful relationship, deep relationships with people anymore, if that was the case. But let's move on. Argument from celibacy. So Vines argue. He asserts, not argues, but he asserts. An assertion is a conclusion with no supporting premises. You just simply, this is it. So that's different from a logical conclusion based on certain premises. So he starts off with the assertion, celibacy is a gift that should be freely chosen, not imposed. Many gay men and LGBT find celibacy to cause them, I quote, grave damage and is deeply destructive. Page 49 of his book. Therefore, imposed celibacy is not an option for LGBT people. Okay, any concerns about this argument? Nick?
Would it be basically saying like those who are chosen by God to be celibate would be not good? Because, I mean, the passage you read the other day, right? There are some who are born as eunuchs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would not that God imposed on them to be celibate, and that is or grave damage or deep destructive or whatever. Would that not like fit within that category? Then basically kind of putting a blame on God.
He actually thinks when he's talking about celibacy as a gift, he's talking God-given gift. So celibacy comes as a God-given gift that he gives certain people. I'm not sure about a person born as a eunuch or born with a serious syndrome. Usually they still lean one way or the other, and with medical consultations and stuff, I suspect that there could still be they would still choose which way physically they are. and they could still have a meaningful sexual relationship within the context of marriage. I know nothing about that. I'm just saying it doesn't preclude it. I just do a little bit about medical. Obviously, you got male and female genitalia, you don't need both. And typically you'll lean one way or the other. The body will lean one way or the other. And so often, as it used to be the case, if the child leaned in the direction of being male, then the female genitalia would either be ignored or some operation would be done. But if they were more female than male, then the male genitalia would be surgically removed. Now that's a bigger issue today because the thing it was usually done when there was a child, so the little kid would never know, may not ever be told about how they were born. Whereas today they're saying, no, let the child decide, and that's a whole other discussion. Tricia, did you have something to say about, okay. Yes, Alexis.
Huge thing, but the last phrase, it just comes off as like super defensive.
Imposed celibacy is not an option?
It's just like flat out statement, like, I don't know. It's just,
We could probably reword it to be a little more palatable, like if celibacy is only a gift, then we should not expect LGBTQ people who don't have that gift to remain celibate. Maybe we could reword it.
Is this what he says in this
Is
book?
what he says, yeah.
But that's what I mean. He's coming across as very defensive to anything other
Yeah,
than
yeah. I forgot your name. Maddie. So Maddie, did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. Just stretch whenever you want, that's fine, don't worry about it. But let's say something about this. There's a problem with this argument, and number one is that, what about singles? What about you guys, who form a much greater percentage than gays within the church, and you wish to follow Christ? Should it be expected that you guys remain celibate? Should that be the expectation? I didn't get married till I was 25. And according to stuff I've read, young guys reach their peak libido sometime around 17, 18, 19, going crazy. So I was celibate, not because I felt it was a gift from God. It was my moral responsibility to stay celibate. Moral responsibility. So both singles, same-sex attracted people, and many pedophiles. By the way, I have an article on pedophilia, and pedophilia is now regarded officially as a sexual orientation by the American Society of Psychologists. Pedophiles are people who are, they distinguish between pedophiles and pedophilic disorder. So you hear about people, most pedophiles, believe it or not, are men, and specifically young men. Oh, they have sex with little kids. Yeah, sex, they're attracted to little kids. They don't just have sex with little kids. In fact, what they found is that for most of us, when you see a little toddler, you think, oh, isn't that little toddler cute? You just want to, hug them. But for a pedophile, the person with, I'm talking about not a pedophile as an offender, but a pedophile as a sexual orientation, their brains are literally wired such that when they see a little toddler, the part of your brain that normally says, oh, isn't that a cute little toddler, take care, make sure it didn't walk on the road, that part is rewired so they become sexually aroused. Literally, and then now the research is, now I'm always cautious when they say research shows, but some peer-reviewed papers say you can actually tell a pedophile at birth. If with sufficient brain scans and seeing how they're wired, you could say this person is going to be a pedophile. That is, they will be sexually aroused by little kids. So,
Is that something you learn?
I wouldn't want to argue against that, Alexis. I don't know, it seems to me so horrible that I think but nevertheless, our sexuality has been corrupted. Now, let me say further about this. This is why the American Society of Psychologists, or is it psychiatrists, one of the two, and I checked this out for myself, just like 6 years ago, decided this is actually a sexual orientation, and they state, and I have quotes, that you're born this way, you can't change the way you are, and that is why even in our own secular rehabilitation system for pedophiles, there's extremely low success rates. Pretty much if you're a pedophile so then they say a pedophilic disorder is when you actually act on your orientation for being attracted to little kids. Normally it would be an opposite. Normally they would say if that's orientation, you have the right to practice that sexuality. But in the case of pedophilia, if you actually act on that, it's called pedophilic disorder. So there are groups online of people who are attracted to little kids, sexually attracted, but have committed themselves to never walk down that road. So I know this is confusing because when I grew up, a pedophile was somebody who assaulted a little kid. That was a pedophile. But now they distinguish between pedophiles as you may never have assaulted or touched or done anything inappropriate with little children, but you are sexually attracted and aroused by them. In that case, you need to abstain. You need to be celibate. At least with little kids, you need to be celibate. Now, there are groups fighting for this, using this, going through the courts, fighting for the same consent, and we're well on our way to that with the power, at least in Canada, we're giving little children to determine their sexuality. So there's a lot of power being given, legal rights to little children to decide their own sexuality. So the next step, which the pedophiles, and I say this in the technical sense, North American Man-Boy Association, something like that. There's an organization that really promotes this. But anyways, let's come back here. Let's just talk about normal, straight, single people. I have friends who are now in their 60s who had never found someone that they would love to marry, would dearly, I know people getting into middle age, they would love to find someone that they could marry. There's been many tearful nights, going to sleep alone, wishing that they had found someone to love. But yet they are Christians who have committed themselves to be holy before the Lord, to live a sanctified life as we saw there, abstain from sexual immorality. So the point here is this, that it is the case that it's not a gift. Some it is. Like Apostle Paul suggested that in his case, it actually talked about it as a gift from God, celibacy. But I didn't see it as a gift from God back when I was, 17 to 25. And in fact, by the time of 23, when I hadn't met my wife yet, I figured I'm going to be single for life. That means I had decided I'm going to have to be celibate for life. Celibate for life. Not a thought, but it's a moral obligation. And if it's a moral obligation, as someone who loves God, I want to be pleasing to Him. I want to live a holy life. So this idea that celibacy only should be expected if it's a gift from God is not quite, he's got a bad case here. And then you look at Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ remained celibate till his death, which is 30 some odd years old. In his mid-30s, maybe, somewhere in there, depending on when he was born and when he died. But it says that he was tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. So don't be thinking that Jesus was never tempted to lust after a woman. No, he didn't, but tempted, it says he was. Forget about the lust part. What about just wanting to be physically intimate with a woman, which is just natural and good? Does Jesus know what it's like to live under the moral obligation of celibacy? Does he know what it's like? And the scriptures indicate that he does. He knows what it's like to say no to marriage because he had his mission, and the mission was obviously couldn't include being married with kids. So Vine's thing falls apart on that aspect. Bottom line is the emphasis, I would say to Vine's, the emphasis should not be on celibacy as a gift, but celibacy as a moral obligation. And as soon as you look at it as a moral obligation, then everything changes. And it is imposed. Moral laws are imposed on us. But, okay, is gay sex an abomination? It comes back to how we interpret certain scriptures. So Vine's argument is this. The reason same-sex relations were condemned in Leviticus is that they violated the patriarchal view that women were inferior to men. Proposition number 2, this patriarchal view has been abandoned by Christians today. Therefore, Christians no longer have a reason for believing same-sex relations are still an abomination. Any comments on that? So his argument is that when he looks at these different ancient quotes, He concludes that whenever a man had sex with a man, he doesn't actually talk much about women having sex with women. Of course, you have to get into that in Romans, where it seems to be equally bad. But he talks about the men part here. They were all, he ought to argue, because they violated the patriarchal view. And therefore, since the patriarchal view has been abandoned by Christians today, therefore Christians no longer have a reason for believing same-sex. So it's not that same-sex relations were wrong. It was the reason why they did same-sex relations back then that made them wrong back then if you did it for those reasons. So as long as you're having sex, two men are having sex, let's say within marriage, just to make it good. Two men are having sex, and they are not violating, and the patriarchal stuff is not an issue in their marriage, then no problem. That's what Vines would argue. Okay, his argument, just by way of response, because I want to wrap it up in 4 minutes here so we can get on to the next section on the problem of evil and suffering. His argument rests heavily on the assumption that if we can figure out the reason God may have given a command in the Bible, and that reason doesn't apply today, then neither does the command. So it rests completely on assuming that he has correctly identified the reason why God said no same-sex relations. But you start doing that, then there's a lot of other things. You might say, well, what's the reason for not adultery? Or what's the reason for not having sex with animals? You know, maybe if that reason doesn't apply today, then it's fine. So here's my response. Obeying God's commands is not contingent upon first figuring out what the reasons for the command might be, and then deciding to obey it or not on the basis of what I think the reason was. If the reason is important, it'll be given in the text, in the biblical text. It'll be given right there. So then we can know whether or not we need to obey these commands today. So, or it'll be specifically superseded. Like, for example, the law was specifically superseded in the New Testament, specifically in Hebrews. It says, it uses the term obsolete. So when you actually look at all the texts in the scriptures, it simply describes same-sex intimacy with no exceptions. It does not add, unless the sexual relations occur within a committed, loving, covenantal marriage. That would be an example of sophistry if you want to insert that in there. And not literally by reproducing your own Bible translation, but so forth. But then that raises a question. Why is it fine to eat bacon but not have sex with a neighbor's wife or murder her husband? Because that's in the law too at Mount Sinai. You shall not kill. And that word kill specifically means take the life of innocent people. You're not allowed to kill innocent people at Mount Sinai. You're not allowed to have sex with your neighbor's wife at Mount Sinai. You're not allowed to steal. But the law has been made obsolete, so now can we kill, steal, and have sex with a neighbor's wife? Why is it? What?
It's answered in the New Testament.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so it's answered in the New Testament, which suggests there's a universal moral law that transcends civilizations. And it would be very odd to give to tell Israel at Mount Sinai, here's how you should live as a righteous nation, but not say anything about the universal moral law. So the mere fact that the universal moral law is included along with all the Levitical laws does not mean that when the Levitical laws are tossed, the universal moral laws are tossed. In fact, in the New Testament, the bar is raised. So in the commands, you shall not kill innocent people. In the New Testament, it says you cannot, it says he who hates his brother, just hates, is a murderer, and no murderer can inherit eternal life. So there's another example. No murder can inherit, that's another of the bar being raised. In the Old Testament, you couldn't actually sleep with a neighbor's wife. Couldn't actually do that. In the New Testament, Jesus says, you can't even look at a woman to lust after her, because if you do, you've committed adultery. So the bar is obviously raised higher. So the Old Testament laws given at Sinai were actually a minimum standard. We see that in the book of Romans. So that by that, even the minimum standard, it could be shown that no human being can be righteous before God. We can't even keep the minimum standard. Forget about where the bar actually is. And so if we're going to figure out where the bar actually is, we're in real trouble. So the whole solution is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And then you will begin to live the way the supernatural life. To set aside the old nature, put on the new nature, you now live the supernatural life so that you find, let's say, online pornography repugnant, repulsive. You actually find it disgusting, and you don't want to go there, even though you can sense that, oh, the flesh might get a bit of a thrill out of that, but there's something more powerful within you. It's the new nature says that's so repugnant. I'm sorry I even thought of that idea of looking at online porn. So that's third thing. A universal moral law is in effect both during and after, as you mentioned, in the New Testament. The sexual laws are repeated in the New Covenant. By the way, testament is just another word for covenant. If you see a New Testament, you get a Hebrew version, it's Brit Hadasha. Hadasha's, Brit is covenant, the new covenant, the everlasting covenant, yeah.
Just answer his question about eating it. That also was answered in the New Testament through many stories.
Exactly. So the Levitical law is done. We can eat bacon. In fact, I had some this morning, I will confess, and I really liked it. But I didn't feel like I sinned, because it's pretty clear that there's no issues eating bacon anymore. Although there are Christians who say we should also keep the law, but that's a whole different topic. Let's wind up here. There's a concept within Christianity of two natures. One is natural, the other is supernatural. This gets the controversial thing. Should we change gay people? Or can a gay person change? And I have always argued, long before it kind of fell out of favor even, that the natural self is the way we naturally are, and nowhere in the scriptures does God say change the old nature. Rather, he gives us a much more powerful approach. He says, consider it dead. And that's an ongoing thing, because it keeps one to climb out of the coffin. Consider it dead. And I say, God, help me to lay aside this old nature whenever I become conscious as trying to get up again. I want you to, I don't want anything to do with this old nature. Just put it aside in the way you meant. So that's all I'll say about that. I think that's probably clear to you that we have two natures, an old and a new. And there was a trend, let's say 25 years ago, 30 years ago, that gay people, there were gay conferences and whatever, Christians, that the idea was to change your natural attractions. And that may happen, and there are people that has happened too, to change your, God just intervenes like he did with my gaming problem and gave me muscle cramps in the muscles that run my eyeballs so that I had to quit cold turkey. Sometimes God just intervenes, but for most men will still be tempted to, take a scope out a woman somewhere and think inappropriate thoughts. Now that, to your encouragement, men and women, as you walk with God, that'll really die down in your life, and it will become something that seldom, if ever, occurs, but as the years go by. But still, you may have to deal with certain temptations, regardless of what they are. Gambling, gaming. I mean, we're talking. Well, gambling is always a little iffy, and gaming is fine. I don't want to say that. Within moderation. There's a lot of things good within moderation, but anything that starts to get a grip on you, you may have to deal with those temptations for the rest of your life. That old nature may never change. And for that reason, the solution is not to try and change the old nature. The solution is start living the supernatural life by putting on the new nature. Let's quit, and let's get back here for the entirely new topic, problem of suffering. You're welcome. Thanks. Thanks for your encouragement. That's no problem. I don't mind. You can leave it there, Alexis.